You are my property now." The Duke's whisper was so close his breath clouded the cold facets of her diamond earring, a predatory heat against her skin. 5 years of mourning is over, Vivienne," Damien Thornfield hissed, his fingers tightening around her waist like iron bands hidden in velvet. "The world has forgotten him, and tonight the law forgets him too." Vivienne Reed felt the emerald silk of her gown turn into a leaden shroud, the weight of his claim dragging her toward a social abyss from which there was no return. She looked out at the glittering sea of aristocrats in the Thornfield ballroom, their faces blurred by her own unshed tears, knowing that within seconds the Duke would announce their engagement and seal her fate forever. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive lies. For 5 grueling years, Vivienne had been the Widow of the Sea, a title that carried the crushing loneliness of a woman whose heart was buried in the Atlantic. When Captain Alexander Reed's ship, the Lady's Grace, vanished off the coast of the Azores, Vivienne's world had fractured. But the tragedy wasn't merely emotional, it was a financial execution. The Duke of Thornfield had spent every day since the disappearance buying up Alexander's debts, turning them into a leash. He hadn't just waited for her to be vulnerable. He had engineered her poverty, stripping away her lands, her dowry, and her dignity until only she remained, the final prize to be collected in a game of high-stakes cruelty. Now the conflict had reached its suffocating apex. The Duke signaled the orchestra to cease, the sudden silence in the hall ringing louder than the music ever could. He stepped forward, pulling Vivienne into the harsh, unforgiving light of the central chandelier. He was a man who had successfully hunted a wounded doe and was now ready to display the pelt. "My friends," he declared, his voice booming with a terrifying triumph that made Vivienne's stomach turn. "Tonight we celebrate the restoration of Blackwood Manor under a new union, a union that ensures Vivienne Reed is never lost to the shadows again." Vivienne's breath hitched. She felt the walls closing in, the stares of the ton judging her for surrendering to the man who had picked her husband's bones clean. If she spoke the vow, Alexander's memory would be scrubbed from history, replaced by the shadow of his greatest enemy. Then the world shattered. Just as Damien opened his mouth to utter the final, binding announcement, a sound like a cannon blast ripped through the ballroom. The massive, 12-foot oak doors, reinforced with iron and centuries of history, didn't just open, they splintered inward. The guests shrieked, diving for cover as the freezing night air and a spray of torrential rain invaded the pristine hall. Standing in the threshold, framed by a jagged arc of lightning that lit up the room in a ghostly strobe, was a silhouette that defied the laws of the living. He was drenched in the brine of the abyss, his clothes tattered rags of a naval uniform, and his face, once the most handsome in London, was a roadmap of silver scars and salt-crusted pain. Captain Alexander Reed did not look like a hero returning from a voyage. He looked like a vengeful god rising from a shipwreck. He took one heavy, sodden step onto the polished marble, the water from his coat staining the Duke's expensive rugs. His eyes, burning with a primal, terrifying focus, locked onto Damien's trembling hand, which was still clutching Vivienne's arm. Without a word, Alexander reached into the breast of his ruined coat and pulled out a tattered, damp piece of parchment. He didn't scream, he didn't roar, he simply held the paper aloft, the ink of their original marriage certificate still legible through the sea stains. The Duke's smug mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated into a caricature of catastrophic shock. The dead hadn't just come back to visit, he had come back to reclaim every inch of the life the Duke had tried to steal. The silence that followed the crash was more agonizing than the storm itself. Vivienne felt the Duke's hand go cold against her skin, his grip slackening as his ego underwent a total, public death. She couldn't breathe, her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence it felt like it might burst. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the flickering candlelight? But the smell was unmistakable, the sharp, biting scent of the open ocean, of wet wool and old blood. Alexander's gaze shifted from the Duke to Vivienne. In that split second, the storm met the anchor. The raw disbelief in her eyes reflected the primal vengeance in his. He looked at her emerald dress, the color of the sea that had tried to keep him, and a flicker of agony crossed his scarred features. He had fought through 5 years of hell, through foreign prisons and desert islands, all fueled by the memory of the woman now standing in another man's house. "Damien," Alexander finally spoke, his voice a low, raspy growl that sounded like stones grinding together at the bottom of the tide. "Keep your hands off my wife." The Duke recoiled as if struck, his jaw dropping, his eyes bulging as he looked from the scarred man to the marriage certificate. The ballroom had become a theater of the macabre. The aristocrats in the background were frozen, realizing they were witnessing the greatest scandal in the history of the peerage. The Duke tried to find his voice, tried to summon the arrogance that had served him for decades, but all that came out was a pathetic, strangled gasp. He realized, in the same second the audience did, that his "You're mine now" whisper had just become his own death warrant. Alexander took another step forward, the light hitting the deep furrow of a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a gift from the night his ship was sabotaged. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Vivienne, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I told you I would come back for you, Vivienne. Did you think the sea was enough to hold me?" Duke's eyes darted toward the guards at the edge of the room, his voice finally cracking through. "He is an imposter, a beggar in a dead man's clothes. Seize him." But no one moved. The weight of the marriage certificate and the sheer, terrifying presence of the captain held the room in a trance. Alexander didn't flinch. He simply stepped closer, the squelch of his boots a rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. He didn't look like a man who wanted a greeting. He looked like a man who wanted blood. Vivienne found her voice, though it was barely a thread of sound. Alexander, the name felt foreign on her tongue, a ghost she hadn't dared to speak in years. The man in the doorway didn't smile. There was too much pain for that, but his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Enough for her to know that the soul of the man she loved was still trapped inside that scarred, salt-beaten shell. The Duke tried to pull her back, a last-ditch effort to reclaim his property, but Vivienne wrenched her arm away. The spell was broken. The widow was dead, and the captain had returned to burn the Duke's world to the ground. The Duke's reign was over, but the captain's war had only just begun. The question wasn't just how he survived, but who had made him suffer, and Alexander Reed looked like he was ready to name every single soul involved, starting with the man standing under the Thornfield chandelier. The salt air didn't always smell like a grave. 5 years ago, it had smelled of ambition, of expensive mahogany, and of the sweet, lingering perfume Vivienne wore on the docks of Tilbury as she waved goodbye to the lady's grace. On that morning, the sun had caught the gold braid on Alexander's shoulders, making him look less like a man and more like a legend in the making. He was the youngest captain in the merchant fleet, a man whose future was as vast and glittering as the horizon he sailed toward. But as Vivienne stood in the wreckage of the Thornfield ballroom 5 years later, staring at the scarred specter of that same man, the memory of that sun-drenched day felt like a cruel taunt. The descent had begun with a letter, not of death, but of silence. 6 months after the Lady's Grace cleared the English Channel, the reports stopped. The shipping company, usually so meticulous with their ledgers, began to speak in hushed tones of unprecedented storms and uncharted currents. Then came the official declaration from the Admiralty. The ship had been lost off the coast of the Azores with all hands. No wreckage was found, no survivors pulled from the brine. Alexander was gone, and in the vacuum left by his disappearance, the vultures began to circle. The first vulture to land on the doorstep of Blackwood Manor wasn't a debt collector with a scowl, but Duke Damien Thornfield with a smile of practiced sympathy. "My dear Lady Vivienne," he had said, his voice a silken purr as he sat in Alexander's favorite velvet armchair, sipping tea that he had likely paid for himself. "A tragedy of this magnitude requires a firm hand to guide the estate. Alexander was a brilliant sailor, but his investments, well, they were as volatile as the sea itself." Vivienne, drowned in a sea of black crepe and numbing grief, had barely heard him. She was a woman who had been raised to understand poetry and piano, not the cutthroat mechanics of maritime interest and compounded loans. She didn't know that the Duke had spent the weeks following the disappearance, quietly buying up every promissory note Alexander had ever signed. He had gone to the London banks, the private lenders, and the shipping insurers, whispering that the Reed estate was a sinking ship and that he was the only one willing to buy the salvage rights. At first, Damien's support felt like a lifeline. When the butcher stopped extending credit, a discreet envelope of cash arrived from the Thornfield estate. When the roof of the West Wing began to leak, a team of the Duke's men arrived to repair it before Vivienne could even ask. He was the perfect gentleman, the morning friend, the steady rock in her turbulent world. But every act of kindness was a link in a chain, and every repair to her home was a new lien against her future. "You shouldn't have to worry about these trivialities," the Duke would say, sliding another document across the mahogany desk for her signature. "Just a formality to ensure the creditors don't harass you. I've taken care of the interest. You're safe with me." Vivienne had signed. She had signed because she was exhausted by grief. She had signed because she wanted to believe that someone cared for her in a world that felt cold and empty. She didn't realize that with every stroke of the pen, she was signing away her autonomy. By the end of the second year, the support had turned into a leash. The Duke no longer waited for her to ask for help. He began to dictate the terms of her life. He suggested, then insisted, that she let go of her loyal staff, replacing them with servants from his own household. He advised her to close off most of Blackwood Manor, claiming the heating costs were prohibitive. Slowly, Vivienne found herself a prisoner in her own home, surrounded by the Duke's people, eating the Duke's food and breathing the Duke's air. She was the widow of the sea, but Damien Thornfield was the tide, and he was slowly eroding the shore she stood upon. "You are a beautiful woman, Vivienne," he told her during the third year, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory hunger that made her skin crawl. "It is a waste to spend your life as a ghost. Alexander would want you to be cared for. He would want you to be mine." The word "mine" had begun to echo in her nightmares long before he whispered it in the ballroom. The financial pressure became a physical weight. The Duke revealed his true hand when he finally showed her the total sum of the debts he had acquired. It was a staggering figure, an impossible mountain of gold that Alexander could not have earned in 3 lifetimes. "I could call these in tomorrow," Damien had said, his voice devoid of its former warmth. "I could have you in a debtor's prison by nightfall. Blackwood would be razed, and your name would be a scandal whispered in the gutters. Or you could accept my protection in a more permanent capacity." The choice was no choice at all. It was an ultimatum wrapped in a proposal. Vivienne looked at the portrait of Alexander that hung in the hallway, the man who had promised to return, the man the sea had stolen, and felt a profound sense of betrayal. Not by Alexander, but by the world that demanded she sell herself to survive his loss. She had become a ghost in her own life, a spectre haunting the halls of a manor that no longer belonged to her. The night of the ball, the emerald dress she wore had been a gift from the Duke. It was the color of the ocean, a cruel reminder of where her heart truly lay. As she walked into the Thornfield ballroom, she felt like a sacrificial lamb led to the altar. The Duke's touch was a brand, his property, whisper the final nail in the coffin of her identity. He had spent 5 years crafting this moment, 5 years turning a tragedy into a transaction. He had won. He had used the debt of a ghost to buy a living woman. But as the doors of the ballroom splintered and the salt-crusted man stepped out of the dark, Vivienne realized that the debt hadn't been paid. Alexander Reed hadn't just been a ghost, he had been a witness. And as she looked into the scarred face of her husband, she saw the truth written in his burning eyes. The Duke hadn't just bought his debts, he had bought the storm that sank the ship. The leash was about to snap. The Duke had spent 5 years building a cage out of gold and lies, but he had forgotten one fundamental truth of the ocean. The tide always turns, and when it does, it brings everything back to the surface, the wreckage, the secrets, and the men who refuse to stay dead. The debt of a ghost was no longer a burden Vivienne carried alone. It was a weapon Alexander had brought home from the abyss, and he looked ready to use it to tear the Duke's world apart, piece by bloody piece. Vivienne stood between the man who owned her and the man she loved, realizing that the 5 years of silence were over. The storm wasn't coming, it was already inside the room. Alexander Reed remembered the exact temperature of the betrayal. It wasn't the freezing bite of the Atlantic or the humid rot of the prison cells that came later. It was the lukewarm, steady hand of his first mate, Elias Thorne, handing him a glass of brandy as the Lady's Grace crested a massive swell off the Azores. "To a swift return, Captain," Elias had said, his eyes avoiding Alexander. 5 years later, standing in the center of the Thornfield ballroom with the weight of 1,000 drowned souls in his lungs, Alexander could still taste the bitter metallic tang of the sedative that had been slipped into that glass. He looked at the Duke, the man who had paid for that brandy, the man who had bought a first mate's soul, and felt the phantom sensation of the deck dropping out from beneath his feet. The night of the accident hadn't been an accident at all. It was a surgical strike. As the drug took hold of his limbs, turning his blood to lead and his vision to a blurred kaleidoscope of grey sea and black sky, Alexander had watched from the floor of his cabin as the Lady's Grace was steered into the teeth of the gale. He had tried to scream, but his throat was a desert. He had tried to reach for the pistol in his desk, but his fingers were numb ghosts. Through the porthole, he saw the flickering lights of another vessel, a black-flagged hunter that didn't fly the colors of any nation. It was a Thornfield ship, a privateer sent to ensure that the captain didn't just disappear, but stayed buried. "The Duke sends his regards, Alexander," Elias had whispered, looming over him as the ship groaned under the pressure of a rogue wave. "He says some treasures are too valuable to be left in the hands of a mere sailor." Then came the roar, not of the wind, but of the hull tearing open. The Duke's men hadn't just relied on the storm, they had planted charges. The explosion was a blinding white flash that threw Alexander across the cabin. The sea, cold and hungry, rushed in to claim its due. He remembered the sensation of being dragged down, the cabin furniture swirling like debris in a vortex, and the terrifying silence of the deep. He should have died then. By all laws of God and physics, Alexander Reed should have been a skeleton in a coral-crusted uniform within the hour. But the Atlantic is a fickle mistress. It rejected him. He had surfaced in a world of chaos, clinging to a shattered piece of the mast. The Lady's Grace was gone, nothing left but a jagged scar of foam on the surface of the black water. For 3 days he drifted, his skin blistering under a sun that felt like a furnace during the day and freezing into a mask of salt at night. He drank the blood of seabirds and licked the dew from the wood. He spoke to Vivienne's ghost, promising her that he would not let the water win. "I am coming back," he had croaked into the empty horizon, his voice a rasp of salt and bile. "Wait for me." He was picked up not by a rescue vessel, but by a slaver bound for the Barbary coast. They saw his scars, his shredded uniform, and the raw strength in his hands, and they saw profit. For 3 years, Alexander was a number, a shadow in the limestone quarries of a desert kingdom. He was beaten until his back was a map of agony. He was starved until his ribs threatened to break through his parchment-thin skin. Every time a whip landed, he whispered a name, Damien. Every time he was denied water, he envisioned a face, Vivienne. The scars on his face, the deep silver furrow that ran from temple to jaw, had been a gift from a guard who tried to take the locket he kept hidden in his mouth. Alexander had nearly bitten the man's hand off, even as the blade carved into his flesh. That locket, a small, intricate piece of gold with a secret latch, was the only thing that kept him tethered to the world of the living. It contained a lock of Vivienne's hair and a miniature portrait that had faded to a ghost of itself. It was his compass, his North Star in a world of absolute darkness. His escape had been a bloodbath. He had waited for the moon to be swallowed by a sandstorm, and then he had used the very chains that bound him to break the necks of his captors. He didn't feel like a hero as he climbed over the bodies of men. He felt like a monster. The Duke had made him this. Damien Thornfield had reached across the ocean and stripped away Alexander's humanity, leaving only the primal instinct of a predator. It took another 2 years to work his way across the Mediterranean, hidden in the holds of grain ships, stowing away on coal barges, and finally signing on as a common deckhand on a merchantman bound for London. He had arrived at the docks that morning with nothing but the rags on his back and the marriage certificate he had kept sewn into the lining of his boot, a document he had protected more fiercely than his own life. He had walked through the streets of London like a revenant. People crossed the street to avoid him. He was a creature of salt and shadows, a man who smelled of the grave and the gale. When he reached the gates of the Thornfield estate and saw the carriages lined up for the ball, he didn't feel anger. He felt a cold, crystalline clarity. He had stood in the rain outside the ballroom, watching the shadows of the dancers flicker against the stained glass windows. He saw a flash of emerald silk, Vivienne. She looked like a statue of grief, even as the Duke leaned in to whisper his poison into her ear. Alexander had gripped the iron railing so hard his knuckles turned white. He saw the Duke's hand on her waist, the hand that had signed the orders for the lady's grace to be sabotaged. The rage that erupted in his chest wasn't hot. It was the absolute zero of the deep ocean. He didn't knock, he didn't ask for permission. He put his shoulder to the oak doors and let the weight of 5 years of suffering do the rest. The splintering wood was the sound of his rebirth. Now standing in the center of the Duke's domain, Alexander felt the salt on his skin begin to itch. He looked at the horrified faces of the ton, the people who had toasted his memory, and then moved on to the next scandal. He looked at Damien, who was shaking with a cowardice that only wealth can hide. And finally, he looked at Vivienne. She was more beautiful than his memories, but she was broken. He could see it in the way she stood, not as a woman, but as a possession. The Duke hadn't just taken his ship and his life, he had tried to colonize Alexander's heart. You think a marriage certificate is just paper, Damien? Alexander's voice was a low, lethal hum. In my world, it's an oath, and I have walked through hell to see it honored. He took a step toward the Duke, his boots squelching with the water of the Thames, the rain of the night, and the brine of the Atlantic. He didn't care about the gold. He didn't care about the manor. He wanted the man who had turned him into a ghost to feel the weight of every wave that had crashed over his head. Alexander Reed was home, and he was finished being a victim. The sea had returned him, not as a husband, but as a reckoning. The silk felt like cold water. It was a vibrant, aggressive emerald, the color of a shallow reef just before a storm hits, and as Vivienne Reed stood before the floor-to-ceiling pier glass in her bedchamber, she felt as though she were being submerged. This was not a gown, it was a shroud. It was the physical manifestation of her surrender, tailored by the Duke's personal seamstress to cling to every curve, to advertise the quality of the prize Damien Thornfield had finally secured. "Tighter, Jane," Vivienne whispered, her voice sounding hollow in the cavernous, half-empty room. The young maid, one of the many replacements sent by the Duke's household, hesitated. "But my lady, you can barely breathe as it is. Your ribs." "Tension is the only thing keeping me upright," Vivienne snapped, though the bite lacked any real venom. It was the fatigue speaking. The bone-deep, soul-shattering exhaustion of a woman who had spent 1,825 days waiting for a ghost to walk through the door. She stared at her reflection, searching for the girl who had stood on the docks 5 years ago. That girl had worn pale blue and carried a heart full of sunlight. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too shadowed, and her lips were set in a line of grim determination. She looked like a marble statue carved by a man who hated beauty. The Duke had chosen this green specifically. "It matches the sea that took him," he had remarked during the final fitting, his hand trailing over her shoulder with a possessiveness that made her stomach turn. "It is time you stopped fighting the tide, Vivienne, become part of it." Every jewel she put on felt like a link in a chain. The diamond earrings were droplets of frozen ice. The necklace was a silver collar. As she reached for the small velvet box on her vanity, the one containing the only thing Damien hadn't been able to take, she felt a momentary spark of rebellion. Inside was the locket Alexander had given her. It was tattered, the gold rubbed thin from years of her thumb tracing the edges in the dark, but it was hers. She moved to clasp it around her neck, but a sharp knock at the door startled her. "The Duke's carriage is here, my lady," the maid announced, her head bowed. "He sent word that he expects you to be wearing the Thornfield emeralds, the ones he sent this morning." Vivienne's hand froze. She looked at the heavy, ornate case on the vanity, a set of emeralds so large and dark they looked like bruised fruit. They were a statement, a brand. To wear them was to publicly acknowledge that she was no longer a Reed. She was a Thornfield asset. She looked at Alexander's locket one last time before snapping the velvet box shut and sliding it into a hidden drawer. She couldn't wear it tonight. She couldn't let Damien see her holding onto a ghost while he paraded her in front of the ton. It would be an insult to Alexander's memory to bring his token into a den of wolves. As she descended the grand staircase of Blackwood Manor, the house itself seemed to groan in protest. The floorboards, stripped of their fine Persian rugs to pay off interest, echoed with a lonely, hollow thud. Most of the manor was dark now, the furniture covered in grey dust cloths like a graveyard of better days. Only the path to the front door was lit, a narrow corridor of light designed to lead her straight into the Duke's waiting arms. Damien stood at the base of the stairs, the moonlight catching the silver head of his cane. He didn't look like a villain, he looked like a savior. That was his greatest weapon. He moved with the practiced grace of a man who believed the world owed him its silence. "Exquisite," he murmured, taking her hand and pressing a dry, cold kiss to her knuckles. "The green suits you. It speaks of a woman who has finally accepted the inevitable." "Is that what this is, Damien? An inevitability?" Vivienne asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her knees. "It is peace, Vivienne," he countered, leading her toward the carriage. "No more debt collectors, no more cold nights in a dying house. Tonight we tell the world that the Reed chapter is closed. You will enter the ballroom as my betrothed, and you will leave it as the future Duchess of Ashbourne. The sea has had its due. Now I shall have mine." The carriage ride to the Thornfield estate was a blur of shadows and the rhythmic clacking of hooves. Vivienne leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the London streets pass by. She saw common couples walking hand in hand, their lives simple and free of the crushing weight of peerage and poverty. She envied them. She envied the dead. She thought of the lady's grace. She thought of how the water must have felt as it rushed into the hull. Had Alexander called her name? Had he been afraid? Or had he welcomed the end, knowing that he was dying a free man? "You're drifting again," the Duke said, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a blade. "Stop it. Tonight you are to be radiant. You are to be grateful. If I see a single tear, I will remind you exactly how much I paid for your brother's commission in the Hussars to be kept out of the courts." The threat was subtle, but it landed with the force of a blow. Damien didn't just own her home, he owned her family's remaining shred of honor. He had mapped out every exit and blocked them all with gold. As the carriage pulled up to the Thornfield gates, the sheer scale of the Duke's power was on full display. Hundreds of lanterns hung from the trees, turning the night into an artificial day. The sound of a full orchestra drifted through the air, upbeat and celebratory, a sharp contrast to the funeral dirge playing in Vivienne's head. The Duke stepped out first, offering his hand with a triumphant flourish. Vivienne took a breath, the corset of the emerald dress squeezing her lungs, and stepped out into the light. The flash of the photographers, powder, and the murmurs of the arriving guests hit her like a physical wave. "The widow of the sea," they whispered. "Look how she shines in the Duke's emeralds." A tragic ending, but a gilded one. She walked through the grand foyer, her head held high, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. Every step felt like she was walking further out into the deep end of an ocean she couldn't swim in. She was the anchor, and Damien was the weight, pulling her down into the silt of a life she didn't want. Inside the ballroom, the heat was stifling. The smell of expensive perfume and beeswax was suffocating. She felt the eyes of every debutante and dowager on her, judging her for her survival, envying her for the wealth she was about to marry into. None of them saw the bruises on her spirit. None of them saw the emerald shroud for what it really was. Damien led her to the center of the room, the music swelling as he prepared to make the announcement. He leaned in, his breath hot and smelling of brandy, and whispered those 4 words that would haunt her forever. "You're mine now, Vivienne." In that moment, Vivienne felt the last spark of the girl on the docks go out. She prepared to close her eyes and let the tide take her. She prepared to say the words that would end her life as Vivienne Reed. But the sea was not done with her. As the Duke opened his mouth to seal the contract, the first crack of thunder rolled across the sky, and the heavy doors of the ballroom began to tremble. Vivienne didn't know it yet, but the shroud was about to be torn away, and the ghost she had been mourning was no longer a memory. He was a reckoning. The splintering of the oak doors was a sound that belonged to the battlefield, not the ballroom. It was a violent, percussive intrusion that severed the Duke's whisper and froze the breath in Vivienne's lungs. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of rain hitting the heated marble floors and the frantic, discordant dying notes of the orchestra. Then, the silhouette stepped through the mist. He looked like a nightmare woven from salt and shadow. Alexander Reed didn't walk into the room, he invaded it. His presence was a physical pressure, a gravitational pull that drew every eye toward the jagged silver scar on his face and the primal, predatory stillness of his posture. He was a creature of the abyss, draped in the rags of a life that should have ended 5 years ago. "I told you," Alexander's voice rasped, a low vibration that seemed to shake the very crystals of the chandelier above them. "Keep your hands off my wife." The Duke was the first to break the paralysis. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, was now a distorted map of terror and fury. He felt the social foundation beneath him, the 5 years of meticulous manipulation and bought loyalty, trembling. He looked at the marriage certificate in the stranger's hand, then at the scarred face, and his survival instinct kicked in with the ferocity of a cornered rat. "Guards," Damien's voice cracked, losing its silken edge. "Seize this vagrant, this madman. How dare you allow a common beggar to breach my home?" The Duke's private security, men in crisp liveries who had never faced a real threat, hesitated. They looked at the man in the doorway. Alexander stood his ground, his feet planted wide as if on a tossing deck, his gaze never wavering from the Duke. There was a lethality in his silence that made the guards' hands tremble on their truncheons. "Damien," Alexander said, taking a heavy, wet step forward, "you haven't changed, still hiding behind other men's coats, still trying to steal what you haven't the courage to earn." "Silence him," the Duke shrieked, his eyes bulging. "He is an impostor, a charlatan hired by my enemies to disrupt this blessed union. Look at him. He is a monster, a ghost. Captain Reed is at the bottom of the Atlantic, and this filth is nothing but a gutter crawler looking for a payday." Vivienne finally found her voice, though it felt like tearing a scab off a wound. "Alexander," she whispered. The name was a prayer, a question, and a scream all at once. She took an instinctive step toward him, her emerald silk rustling like the leaves of a dying tree. "Vivienne, stay back," the Duke commanded, reaching for her arm again. "It's a trick, a cruel, calculated play on your grief. Do not look at it." But Alexander's eyes met hers, and in that moment, the 5 years of separation vanished. It wasn't the scars she saw, it was the depth of the ocean in his pupils. It was the way he tilted his head, a gesture she had memorized over 1,000 shared breakfasts. It was the raw, unadulterated pain that flared in his gaze when he saw her in the Duke's emeralds. "It's me, Vivienne," he said, his voice softening just enough to break her heart. "The sea tried to keep me, the Duke tried to kill me, but I am home." The ballroom erupted into chaos. The guests, recovered from their initial shock, began to murmur with the feverish intensity of a hive. The scandal was no longer a whisper, it was an explosion. "He's alive," a dowager cried. "Look at the scars, it's a devil in his skin," another hissed. The Duke, sensing he was losing the room, lunged toward the captain of the guards. "I want him in chains. Now, this is trespassing, this is an assault on the peerage. I will have him hanged for this deception. He is a vagrant, a lunatic escaped from Bedlam." 3 guards, emboldened by the Duke's proximity, finally lunged at Alexander. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Alexander didn't fight like a gentleman, he fought like a man who had survived a slave quarry. He caught the first guard's wrist, the bones snapping with a sickening pop, and used the man's momentum to hurl him into the second. The third guard swung a truncheon, but Alexander ducked, the air whistling over his head, and delivered a short, powerful blow to the man's solar plexus that dropped him to his knees. Alexander didn't stop. He walked straight toward the Duke, the damp marriage certificate still held high. "Call them off, Damien, unless you want the ton to watch me take your head right here under your own chandelier." You are a ghost," the Duke stammered, backing away until his heels hit the edge of the orchestra dais. "You have no rights here, you were declared dead. Your property, your title, your wife, everything belongs to the state, and I have bought the state's interest." "You bought the debt," Alexander countered, his voice rising to fill every corner of the silent hall. "But you didn't buy the man, and as long as I draw breath, this woman is Lady Reed, not your property, not your prize." The Duke turned to the crowd, his hands shaking as he gestured wildly. "Can you not see the fraud? Look at his face. That is not Alexander Reed. It is a mask of scars. Constable, someone call the Metropolitan Police. I want this man arrested for impersonation and attempted murder." A tall, grim-faced man in evening dress stepped out of the crowd. It was Lord Harrington, the magistrate of the district. "The Duke is right about one thing, Damien," Harrington said, his voice cold. "A man cannot simply walk in from the rain and claim a life that has been legally extinguished. There must be proof. There must be an inquiry." The Duke's eyes lit up with a desperate hope. "Exactly, an inquiry. Take him to the cells. Let him rot until we can prove he is a liar." "No," Vivienne spoke up, her voice suddenly clear and resonant, cutting through the Duke's frantic posturing. She walked past Damien, ignoring his outstretched hand, and stood directly in front of Alexander. The smell of him, salt, iron, and the cold night, hit her like a physical blow. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the silver furrow of the scar on his jaw. "Vivienne, don't," the Duke warned. She didn't listen. She looked deep into Alexander's eyes, searching for the man who had left her on the docks. "He is no vagrant," she said, turning to face the magistrate and the shocked ballroom. "This is my husband. I know his eyes, I know his heart, and if you take him to a cell, you will have to take me with him." The Duke let out a strangled cry of rage, his face turning a dark, dangerous purple. "She is hysterical. The shock has broken her mind. Guards, take the vagrant away. I will deal with the lady's delusions in private." But the momentum had shifted. The sight of the widow of the sea, standing in her emerald shroud next to the salt-stained hero, was a visual hook that no one in the room could ignore. The status war had begun. And while the Duke had the gold and the guards, the captain had the truth and the woman. "The certificate stays with me," Alexander said, tucking the damp parchment back into his coat as the remaining guards circled him warily. "And Vivienne stays with me. You've had 5 years to play at being a man, Damien. Your time is up." The Duke watched, powerless and humiliated, as Alexander took Vivienne's hand, not with the iron grip of an owner, but with the calloused, steady palm of a protector. The ghost in the ballroom hadn't just returned, he had reclaimed the center of the world. The silence of the Duke's private study was more claustrophobic than the roar of the ballroom. Outside the heavy mahogany doors, the muffled chaos of 100 panicked aristocrats continued, a low hum of scandal and confusion. But inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the sharp, antiseptic scent of the brine dripping from Alexander's tattered coat. Lord Harrington, the magistrate, stood by the fireplace, his face a grim mask of legal impartiality. Duke Damien Thornfield paced the perimeter of the room like a caged leopard, his fingers twitching near the silver head of his cane. And in the center, under the unforgiving glare of a gaslit chandelier, stood the man who claimed to be a ghost. "This is an absurdity," the Duke spat, his voice trembling with a volatile mixture of fear and fury. "A visual inspection by a woman who has spent 5 years in the throes of a nervous breakdown is not legal evidence. Look at him, Harrington. He is a butcher's shop of a man. His own mother wouldn't recognize that wreckage of a face." Alexander didn't look at the Duke. He didn't look at the magistrate. His eyes were anchored to Vivienne, who stood shivering in her emerald silk, the heavy Thornfield jewels feeling like cold lead against her skin. "The law requires a positive identification for the reinstatement of marital rights and the freezing of the estate's debts," Harrington said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "Lady Vivienne, I must ask you to be clinical. You are not looking for the man you loved. You are looking for the biological truth of Captain Alexander Reed. If you falsely identify an impostor, you will be complicit in a fraud against the crown." Vivienne took a shaky step forward. The emerald dress rustled, a sound that reminded her of the sea. "I don't need a clinical eye to know my husband," she whispered. "Then prove it," the Duke challenged, stopping his packing to loom over her. "Tell the magistrate about the scars, not the ones on his face. Anyone could have carved those to mimic a shipwreck. Tell us of the marks that only a wife would know, marks that a beggar from the docks couldn't possibly simulate." Alexander reached for the buttons of his ruined naval jacket. His hands were calloused, his knuckles scarred from years of hard labor in foreign quarries, but his movements were steady. He stripped away the tattered wool, then the salt-stained linen of his shirt, dropping them to the Duke's pristine Persian rug. Vivienne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Alexander's torso was a testament to survival. His chest was a roadmap of agony, the jagged white lines of whip marks across his shoulders, the puckered indentation of a musket ball near his ribs, and the raw, red welts of a life lived in chains. He looked less like a man and more like a ruined cathedral. "Do you see, Vivienne?" the Duke sneered, though his face had turned a sickly shade of grey. "He is a professional victim. These are the marks of a common criminal, a man who has spent his years in a penal colony, not a gentleman captain." Vivienne ignored him. She stepped into the circle of heat radiating from Alexander's body. She could smell the salt, yes, but beneath it was the faint, familiar scent of cedarwood and the iron-rich tang of blood. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from a specific spot just below his collarbone. "Alexander had a mark," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It wasn't a scar from a whip or a blade. It was a birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon, hidden beneath the hollow of his left shoulder." She pressed her fingers against his skin. It was hot, scorching compared to the Duke's cold touch. She felt the muscle beneath the skin ripple, a physical confirmation of life. There, obscured by a faint, jagged line of a more recent injury, was the crescent. "The moon," she breathed. "Coincidence?" the Duke barked, stepping closer. He could have observed Alexander in a bathhouse. He could have heard a servant's gossip. "There is more," Vivienne said, her eyes finally lifting to meet Alexander. The silver scar on his face didn't frighten her now. It was merely a veil she had to look through. The night before the Lady's Grace sailed, Alexander was working in the study. He slipped with a letter opener. He caught his palm, the right one. Alexander slowly turned his hand over. He opened his palm. In the center of the calloused, salt-beaten skin was a thin, horizontal white line. It was a domestic injury, a small, private scar that carried no glory and no tragedy. It was a mark of the man, not the hero. "He also has a splinter of lead in his thigh from a hunting accident when he was 12, Vivienne continued, her words tumbling out now, a torrential release of 5 years of suppressed memory. "And he has a faint tattoo on the inside of his wrist, not a sailor's anchor, but the initials VR. He did it himself with a needle and ink when we were secretly engaged." Alexander pulled back the tattered sleeve of his undershirt. There, faded but unmistakable, were the letters VR. The silence that followed was heavy with the Duke's impending ruin. Damien Thornfield backed away, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. His empire of debt, his carefully constructed cage of emeralds and lies, was dissolving in the light of a few small marks of ink and flesh. "Magistrate," Alexander said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Is this sufficient, or would you like me to recount the specific details of the Duke's last letter to me, the one where he promised to take care of my wife if I didn't return?" Lord Harrington looked from the tattoo to the birthmark, then at the Duke's trembling hands. "The identification is positive. Under the laws of the Admiralty and the Peerage, Captain Alexander Reed is officially returned from the dead. All contracts, engagements, and transfers of property made in the interim are hereby suspended pending a full judicial inquiry." The Duke let out a sound that was half sob, half growl. "This is not over. I still hold the notes. I own the land. I will have you both in the streets." Alexander stepped forward, his naked, scarred chest a wall of defiance. He didn't need a sword or a pistol. His presence alone was a weapon. "You own the paper, Damien, but the man who signed it is back. And I have brought more than just scars with me from the Atlantic. I have brought a memory of the black-flagged ship that rammed the Lady's Grace." Vivienne felt a surge of hope so powerful it made her dizzy. She looked at the Duke, who looked like he was suffering a total ego death. The man who had whispered, "You're mine now," was suddenly small, a pathetic figure shrinking in the shadow of a giant. She turned back to Alexander. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't look like a vengeful god. He looked like a man who was desperately afraid she wouldn't want the wreckage he had become. "Alexander," she whispered. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "I am a stranger to this world now, Vivienne," he said, his voice cracking, "but I am no stranger to you." The Duke's private room, once a sanctuary of his power, had become the site of his execution. The identification was complete. The ghost had a name, a heart, and a wife, and as the magistrate began to write the official decree, Vivienne realized that the emerald shroud was finally falling away. She wasn't a widow, and she wasn't property. She was the wife of a man who had conquered the sea to find her. The war for their lives had just moved from the ballroom to the courtroom, but as Vivienne leaned her head against Alexander's scarred chest, she knew that for the first time in 5 years, the tide was finally on her side. The dawn that followed the ballroom catastrophe did not bring the clarity of a new day. Instead, it arrived with the sulphurous yellow fog of a London winter, a thick, suffocating veil that mirrored the Duke's shifting tactics. Damien Thornfield did not possess the physical scars of a survivor, but he possessed the institutional scars of a man who had spent decades carving his will into the marble halls of Westminster. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the shock that had paralyzed him in the study had been replaced by a cold, calculating malice. He had realized that while he could not kill the man in the ballroom, he could kill the man in the eyes of the law. Vivienne sat in the morning room of Thornfield's townhouse, for she had been forbidden from returning to Blackwood until the legal status of the inhabitants was clarified. She stared at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, her emerald dress replaced by a borrowed gown of charcoal wool that felt like a penance. Across from her, Alexander sat like a statue of salt-crusted granite. He refused the cushioned chairs, opting instead to stand by the window, his eyes scanning the street as if expecting a boarding party. The door burst open, not with the violence of a shipwreck, but with the arrogant flourish of a man who still believed he held the keys to the kingdom. Damien Thornfield entered, flanked by 2 men in austere black frock coats, solicitors from the King's Bench, whose expressions were as dry as parchment. "You look tired, Vivienne," the Duke remarked. His voice regained its silken, predatory edge. He didn't look like a man who had suffered a public humiliation. He looked like a judge delivering a verdict. Grief can do strange things to the mind. It can make us see faces in the fog. It can make us hallucinate birthmarks where there are only bruises. "The magistrate saw the marks, Damien," Vivienne said, her voice trembling with a strength she was only just discovering. "The identification was positive." "The identification was emotional," the Duke countered, stepping toward the mahogany table and dropping a heavy, wax-sealed folder onto its surface. "And emotion holds no weight in the High Court of Chancery. Harrington is a romantic fool. Fortunately, the Lord Chancellor is a man of facts." Alexander turned from the window, his movements slow and lethal. "The facts are written in ink on the certificate I carried from the Azores, Damien. The facts are written in the blood I spilled to keep it." "Ah, the certificate," the Duke smiled, and it was a soundless, terrifying baring of teeth. He gestured to the senior solicitor. "Mr. Galsworthy, if you would be so kind as to explain the findings of the Admiralty's archival specialists." The solicitor stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "It is a matter of profound gravity. We have compared the document presented by this individual against the official marriage registers held at St. Jude. While the signatures appear to be a passable imitation, the vellum itself is of a grain not used by the parish in 1878. Furthermore, the ink contains traces of a synthetic pigment that was not commercially available in London until 1882. The world seemed to tilt beneath Vivienne's feet. "That's impossible. I saw him sign it. I have my own copy." "A copy that has been in your possession, in a house maintained by the Duke's funds for 5 years, the Duke interrupted, his voice a low purr. "How easy it would be for an impostor, a man who perhaps served as a common sailor under the real Alexander Reed, to steal the details of a life and commission a forgery. You were looking for a savior, Vivienne. You were an easy mark for a conman who learned your husband's secrets before the lady's grace went down." "You lie," Alexander said. "It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact that carried the weight of a mountain." "The law says otherwise," the Duke snapped, his mask of civility finally cracking to reveal the rotting ego beneath. "As of 1 hour ago, a writ of supersedious has been issued. The marriage certificate you presented has been declared a fraudulent document, a clever forgery intended to obstruct the legal transfer of the Reed estate. You are not a hero, sir. You are a vagrant in a dead man's boots. And under the Vagrancy Act, I am within my rights to have you committed to Newgate until a full criminal trial for fraud can be convened." The Duke turned to Vivienne, his eyes burning with a possessive fire. "You see, my dear, he is a phantom, a trick of the light. The man you loved is dead, and this creature is merely a scavenger picking at the remains of your loyalty. But I am merciful. If you sign the confession stating that you were coerced into this identification by threats of violence, I will ensure he is merely deported rather than hanged." This was the Duke's true power, not the strength of his arms, but the weight of the bureaucracy he controlled. He had spent the night pulling every favor, calling in every debt, and bribing every clerk in the Admiralty to ensure that the truth was rewritten. He was trying to turn Alexander back into a ghost through the stroke of a pen. "I won't sign it," Vivienne said, standing up. She walked to Alexander's side, her hand finding his calloused, scarred palm. "Because it isn't a lie. I don't care what your ink specialists say. Ink can be bought, truth cannot." "Then you are choosing to hang with him," the Duke hissed. "Harrington can no longer protect you. The political winds have shifted. By sunset, the guards will return, and this time they will not be stopped by a piece of damp paper. They will come with shackles." Alexander looked down at Vivienne, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the defiance. He realized then that the Duke's strike wasn't just against his identity, it was a test of Vivienne's will. The Duke believed that by attacking the proof, he could break the bond. "You think the law is a cage, Damien," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that seemed to chill the very air in the room. "You think you can bury me under a mountain of parchment, but I have survived the crushing depths of the Atlantic and the burning heat of the quarries. Do you really think a few forged reports from a bribed clerk are enough to hold me?" "They are enough to hang you," the Duke roared. "Then let them try," Alexander countered. He leaned in closer to the Duke, the scent of salt and impending violence radiating from him. "But remember this, a man who has already died once has nothing left to fear from the gallows. But you have everything to lose. Your title, your lands, your reputation. Every lie you tell is just another stone in the pocket of a drowning man." The Duke recoiled, his face pale, the arrogance momentarily faltering. He had expected Alexander to plead, to flee, or to break. He had not expected the captain to treat the threat of death as a mere change in the weather. As the Duke and his solicitors retreated to the safety of the hallway to coordinate their next move, Alexander turned to Vivienne. The room felt smaller, the yellow fog pressing against the windows like a physical enemy. "He's going to use the courts to erase me, Vivienne," Alexander said, his eyes searching hers. "In their world, if it isn't written on a ledger, it didn't happen. He has the gold to buy the history books." "Then we find the one thing he can't buy," Vivienne said, her heart hammering with a new, desperate resolve. "We find the proof of the sabotage. We find the black-flagged ship. If we can prove he tried to murder you, his forgery claims won't matter." The Duke's counter-strike had been a masterpiece of political maneuvering, but it had made one fatal error. It had given Vivienne a reason to fight. The widow was truly gone. In her place was a woman who realized that in the world of the Duke, the truth wasn't something you found, it was something you fought for. The captain was home, the Duke was desperate, and the battle for the Reed soul had moved from the ballroom to the very heart of the British Empire. The shadows were lengthening, and as the fog thickened, the game of life and death reached its most treacherous turn. The yellow fog of London had transitioned into a bruised, purple twilight, pressing against the windows of the Duke's townhouse like a physical weight. Inside, the atmosphere was no less suffocating. Alexander stood by a heavy oak sideboard, his hands, stained with the grease of a dozen docks and the salt of 1,000 waves, moving with a delicate, surgical precision. He wasn't looking for jewelry or gold. He was looking for the one thing a man like Damien Thornfield could never truly destroy, his own record of greed. "He thinks I came back for the name, Vivienne," Alexander murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to cut through the oppressive silence of the room. "He thinks I came back for the title and the silver. He doesn't understand that a man who has lost everything learns to value only the things that can be used as a blade." Vivienne stood by the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every floorboard that creaked under Alexander's weight felt like a gunshot. The solicitors are still in the drawing room, Alexander. If they find us here, in the Duke's private quarters, Harrington won't be able to stop the arrest. You'll be in Newgate before the moon rises." "Then let them come," Alexander countered, his fingers finding a hidden catch beneath the decorative molding of a built-in bookshelf. With a muffled thud, a small compartment swung open. Damien is a creature of habit. He believes that his status is a shield, but men who believe they are untouchable always keep a ledger of their sins. They need to see their power written in ink. He reached into the dark recess and pulled out a book bound in scarred black goatskin. It wasn't the ornate, gold-leafed volume one would expect of a duke. It was a working man's ledger, the kind used by shipping clerks and insurance adjusters. Alexander flipped it open, the pages smelling of old dust and iron gall ink. "Here," he said, his eyes scanning the columns with a lethal intensity. "The Lady's Grace, July 1881. Vivienne moved to his side, her breath catching as she looked at the handwriting she recognized all too well. It was the Duke's elegant, sloping script, but the content was a nightmare of cold-blooded mathematics. "Insurance valuation, £40,000, Vivienne read aloud, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "Total cargo worth, £12,000, potential profit on total loss, £28,000. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. He didn't just want to remove you, Alexander. He wanted the payout. He had mortgaged his own estates to fund his political rise, and the Lady's Grace was his exit strategy. "It's more than just the money, Vivienne," Alexander said, turning the page. "Look at the names. Lloyd's of London, the Maritime Board. He didn't just sink a ship. He sold the souls of 40 men to cover his gambling debts and his bribes to the Chancellor. He orchestrated the disappearance so he could claim the insurance without the mess of a recovery effort. If a single sailor had survived to tell the tale of the black-flagged privateer, the fraud would have been exposed. That's why he was so certain I was dead. He didn't leave it to the sea. He paid for the execution." The ledger was a roadmap of a massacre. It detailed the exact bribes paid to the port authorities to overlook the adjustments made to the Lady's Grace's hull. It listed the payments made to Elias Thorne, the first mate who had poisoned Alexander's brandy. It was a cold, calculated inventory of murder for profit. "This is the forgery he was so afraid of," Alexander said, his grip tightening on the black book until his knuckles turned white. "He can bribe the clerks at the Admiralty to say my marriage certificate is fake, but he can't erase this. This is his signature, his seals, and his handwriting. This is the rope that will hang him." Suddenly, the heavy doors of the study swung open. Duke Damien Thornfield stood in the threshold, his face no longer a mask of aristocratic calm. It was a twisted, livid red, his eyes fixed on the black book in Alexander's hand. Behind him, the two solicitors hovered like shadows, their faces pale with the sudden realization that the vagrant had found the one thing they had been hired to hide. "Give it to me," the Duke commanded, his voice a strangled rasp. "You have no right to touch that. It is private property. It is protected by the Crown." "Private property," Alexander laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that had no mirth in it. "Is that what you call the lives of my crew, Damien? Is that what you call the 5 years you stole from my wife? This isn't property. This is a confession." "It is a forgery," the Duke screamed, stepping into the room, his cane raised as if to strike. "Just like the certificate, no one will believe a word of it. I will say you stole a blank ledger and filled it with lies. I am a Duke of the realm. My word is law." "Your word is a dying breath," Alexander countered, stepping forward to meet him. He didn't flinch as the Duke swung the silver-headed cane. He caught it in his calloused palm, the impact echoing through the room, and wrenched it from Damien's hand with a single violent motion. "The Maritime Board might be in your pocket, but the insurance underwriters are not. They hate being cheated even more than they hate a scandal, when they see the discrepancy between the cargo manifest and your private payout. They will tear you apart." The Duke backed away, his breath coming in shallow, frantic hitches. He looked at the solicitors, but they were already retreating, their loyalty dissolving the moment they saw the evidence of a capital crime. They knew the difference between a civil dispute and a hanging offense. "Vivienne," the Duke pleaded, his eyes darting toward her with a desperate, pathetic hope. Think of the scandal, think of your name. If this goes to court, you will be the widow of a fraud, the wife of a man who brought down a great house. We can settle this. I will give you Blackwood. I will forgive all debts. Just give me the book. Vivienne looked at the man who had whispered, "You're mine now," in the ballroom. She looked at the man who had tried to buy her soul with her own husband's blood. She felt a cold, sharp clarity that she had never known before. "My name was never yours to protect, Damien," she said, her voice like ice. "And my husband is not a fraud. He is the man who survived you. Alexander, take the book to Harrington, now." "You won't make it to the magistrate's office," the Duke roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I have men on every corner. I will have you killed in the street and the book burned before the ink is dry." "Then you had better send more than 3 guards this time," Alexander said, his voice dropping to that lethal, jagged whisper. He tucked the ledger into his coat and reached out for Vivienne's hand. "Because the sea didn't kill me, and your gold won't either. The tide is coming in, Damien, and you're the only thing left on the shore." As they moved toward the door, the Duke let out a primal, animalistic scream of frustration. He knew the cage was broken. He knew that the hidden ledger was the final piece of the puzzle that would turn his counter-strike into a suicide note. The war wasn't just about a marriage anymore. It was about the 40 men at the bottom of the Atlantic. It was about justice for a ghost who refused to stay silent. And as Alexander and Vivienne stepped out into the swirling London fog, the Black Book was a heavy, sacred weight against Alexander's chest, the blade that would finally cut the Duke's throat. The fog had transformed from a yellow veil into a suffocating, sightless shroud, swallowing the street lamps of Mayfair and turning the cobblestones into a slick, treacherous trap. Inside the Duke's townhouse, the silence was no longer the oppressive quiet of wealth. It was the frantic, airless hush of a sinking vessel. Damien Thornfield stood in the center of his dressing room, his hands trembling so violently he could barely snap the catches on his traveling case. The ledger was gone. The solicitors had vanished. The magistrate was likely even now reading the inventory of his murders. "The carriage is at the rear service entrance, Your Grace," a terrified valet whispered from the doorway, "but the streets are being watched. There is a man, a scarred man, circling the square like a wolf." "Then we do not leave through the square," the Duke hissed, his face a ghostly, sweating mask of desperation. He reached into a velvet-lined drawer and pulled out a small, snub-nosed derringer. He didn't have the stomach for a duel, but he had the cowardice of a man who would burn the world to stay warm. "And we do not leave alone." In the guest chambers, Vivienne had not slept. She sat on the edge of the bed, her charcoal gown wrinkled, her ears straining for the sound of Alexander's voice. She knew he was out there, in the dark, weaving through the fog like the privateer he had once fought. She also knew that a cornered Damien Thornfield was more dangerous than the storm that had wrecked the lady's grace. The door to her room didn't open, it was kicked inward. The Duke stood there, his cravat undone, his eyes wide and bloodshot with the madness of a man whose ego had undergone a total collapse. He wasn't the polished aristocrat anymore, he was a common predator. "Get up," he commanded, the derringer pointed directly at her chest. "The game has changed, Vivienne. If I am to be a ruin, I will not be a ruin alone. You are still my betrothed in the eyes of the papers I haven't yet burned. You are coming with me to the coast." "You're insane, Damien," Vivienne said, her voice remarkably steady. The 5 years of fear had finally crystallized into a diamond-hard contempt. "The ledger is with the magistrate. There is no coast far enough. There is no ship fast enough." "We shall see," the Duke sneered, grabbing her by the arm with a grip that bruised the skin. "If Alexander Reed wants his wife back, he will have to follow me into the Channel. And I have spent my life making sure the Channel is a graveyard for men like him." He dragged her through the servants' passage, a narrow, winding artery of the house that smelled of coal dust and desperation. Vivienne struggled, her heels catching on the stone steps, but the Duke was fueled by a manic, adrenaline-soaked strength. They emerged into the damp, freezing air of the mews, where a nondescript black carriage waited, its lamps extinguished. The Duke shoved her inside, slamming the door, and barked an order to the driver. As the carriage lurched forward, the iron-rimmed wheels screeching against the wet stones. A shadow detached itself from the fog. "Damien!" The voice was a roar that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Alexander appeared at the edge of the light, his salt-stained coat fluttering like a battle flag. He lunged for the horse's harnesses, his hands, those powerful, scarred hands, grabbing at the leather. "Drive!" the Duke screamed, leaning out the window and firing the derringer into the dark. The crack of the pistol was deafening in the narrow alley. The horses reared, whinnying in terror, and the carriage jolted violently. Alexander was thrown back, his shoulder hitting the brick wall with a sickening thud. Vivienne screamed his name, her hands clawing at the carriage door, but the Duke pulled her back, his hand over her mouth. "He's dead, Vivienne. He's finally dead." The Duke laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound as the carriage gained speed, disappearing into the swirling grey void of the London night. But Alexander Reed was not dead. He lay in the filth of the mews for only a heartbeat, the breath knocked from his lungs, his shoulders screaming in protest. He had survived the Atlantic. He would not be stopped by a lead ball fired by a coward. He rolled to his feet, his eyes burning with a primal, focused rage. He didn't have a carriage, he didn't have a horse. He had the knowledge of the docks. He knew where the Duke would go. There was only one pier in London where a man could disappear without a manifest, a place where Thornfield's gold still held a lingering, rotted influence, the Blackwall Stairs. Inside the carriage, the Duke was a whirlwind of frantic movement. He was checking his watch, peering through the blinds, and checking the primings of his pistol. Vivienne sat in the corner, her mind racing. She saw the Duke's weakness now, the way he looked at the shadows, the way he jumped at the sound of every passing cart. He wasn't a master of the world. He was a thief fleeing the scene of a crime. "He's coming for you," Vivienne whispered, her voice a lethal promise. "Shut up," the Duke barked, backhanding her across the face. "He is a ghost, and I am tired of ghosts." The carriage arrived at the docks as the tide was beginning to turn. The air was thick with the smell of low-tide mud, rotting fish, and coal smoke. A small skiff waited at the water's edge, manned by two rough-looking sailors who didn't ask questions. The Duke dragged Vivienne toward the boat, the derringer pressed against the small of her back. "Into the boat, Vivienne. We reach the schooner in the Reach, and by dawn we are in international waters. I will make you a duchess in a land where the magistrates' letters mean nothing." They reached the edge of the pier, the water lapping hungrily at the wooden pilings. But as the Duke stepped toward the skiff, a figure rose from the darkness of a stack of shipping crates. It wasn't a ghost, it was a reckoning. Alexander stood there, his shirt torn, blood seeping through the shoulder of his coat, but his posture was as straight as a mast. He held the black ledger in one hand and a heavy iron beating pin in the other. He had run through the back alleys of Wapping, cutting across the bends of the river, driven by a singular, obsessive purpose. "The tide is out, Damien," Alexander said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that carried over the sound of the water. "And there's nowhere left to run." The Duke spun around, pulling Vivienne in front of him as a shield, the barrel of the pistol trembling against her temple. "Stay back. I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll send her to the bottom before I let you have her." "You already tried to send us to the bottom," Alexander said, taking a slow, measured step forward. He didn't look at the gun. He looked only at the Duke's eyes, seeing the exact moment the man's soul withered. "But the sea didn't want us, and neither does the earth. You're the only thing that belongs in the dark, Damien." The two sailors in the skiff, seeing the scarred giant and the bleeding Duke, didn't wait for their pay. They pushed off, the oars splashing as they vanished into the fog. The Duke was alone. "I have the gold," the Duke screamed, his voice breaking. "I can give you everything, the estates, the titles, just let me go." "You have nothing," Alexander said, dropping the ledger onto the damp wood of the pier. "Not even your life. That belongs to the 40 men of the Lady's Grace." In a final, desperate act of malice, the Duke pulled the trigger, but the sea air had dampened the powder, and the derringer merely clicked, a hollow, pathetic sound. In that second, Vivienne acted. She slammed her elbow into the Duke's ribs and twisted away. Alexander lunged. The collision was a clash of two worlds, the fraudulent power of the land, and the raw, salt-beaten vengeance of the sea. Alexander didn't use the iron pin, he used his hands. He caught the Duke by the throat, lifting him off his feet. The Duke's heels kicked uselessly at the air, his face turning a dark, bruised purple as the property whisperer finally felt the weight of his own debts. "Alexander, no," Vivienne cried, reaching for his arm. "Don't become the monster he made you." Alexander looked at the Duke, whose eyes were bulging with the terror of a man seeing his own end. For a heartbeat, the Atlantic roared in Alexander's ears, demanding blood for blood. But then he looked at Vivienne, at the woman who had found him through the scars, the woman who had stood in the emerald shroud and chose him. He didn't kill him, he threw him. The Duke hit the muddy banks of the Thames with a wet, heavy thud. He lay there, gasping for air, a ruined heap of silk and cowardice, as the first light of dawn began to pierce the fog. Behind them, the sound of police whistles echoed through the docks. Lord Harrington and the Metropolitan Police had arrived. The midnight escape was over. The Duke was in the mud, and the captain was standing in the light. Alexander turned to Vivienne, his face a map of pain and relief, and for the first time in 5 years, the sea was finally at peace. The dawn that finally broke over the Blackwall stairs was not the soft, golden light of a romantic novel. It was a cold, clinical grey that stripped away the glamour of the London fog and revealed the raw, jagged truth of the men standing on the riverbank. The Thames was at its lowest ebb, the receding tide exposing the black, stinking mud and the skeletal remains of forgotten wrecks. In the center of this graveyard of industry stood Captain Alexander Reed, his hand firmly gripping the arm of Lady Vivienne, and at his feet, sprawled in the filth of the riverbed, was the Duke of Thornfield. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden pier above announced the arrival of the high society that Damien had tried so desperately to master. Lord Harrington, the magistrate, led a contingent of Metropolitan Police, but behind them, drawn by the explosive rumors that had ripped through the ballrooms of Mayfair, was a flock of the city's elite. There were earls in silk hats and dowagers in fur-lined cloaks, all peering down from the safety of the dock at the muddy spectacle below. The Duke, the man who had been the arbiter of their social standing for a decade, was now a pathetic, gasping creature covered in the slime of the river. "Damien Thornfield," Harrington's voice rang out, carrying the authority of the Crown. "By the power vested in me, and upon the evidence contained within the maritime ledgers recovered from your private residence, I place you under arrest for the crimes of insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and the sabotage of the Lady's Grace." The Duke scrambled to his knees, his fine wool trousers ruined by the muck, his hair matted with the brine of the Thames. He looked up at the faces of his peers, searching for a single spark of sympathy, a single ally among the people he had bullied and bought, but he found only the cold, mirrored surface of their judgment. The ton did not protect the fallen, they fed on them. "It's a lie," the Duke shrieked, his voice cracking like a broken reed. "The ledger is a forgery. This man, this creature, is a vagrant. Vivienne, tell them he forced you to say these things." Vivienne stepped forward, her charcoal dress stained at the hem, her face pale but illuminated by a fierce internal fire. She didn't look like the widow of the sea anymore. She looked like the judge, the jury, and the executioner. "The only thing forced in this world, Damien, was my silence," she said, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the warehouses. "I stood by while you picked the bones of my husband's estate. I wore your emeralds like a brand, but the sea has a way of returning what is stolen. Alexander didn't just bring back a ledger, he brought back the truth. You sank 40 men for the price of a political seat. You are not a duke, you are a murderer who happened to be born in a manor." A collective gasp went up from the crowd on the pier. The revelation of the insurance fraud was the final blow. In the world of the British Empire, a man might survive a scandal of the heart, but he could never survive a scandal of the ledger. To cheat the underwriters was to cheat the very foundations of the city. Alexander took a step toward the Duke. He didn't raise his fist. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out the locket Vivienne had mentioned in the study, the one with the secret latch. He opened it and held it out, not for the Duke to see, but for the crowd. "Inside this gold," Alexander said, his voice a low, rhythmic drumbeat, is the reason I survived 5 years of hell. It wasn't for the gold in the lady's grace. It wasn't for the land at Blackwood. It was for the woman you tried to turn into a piece of property. You thought you could erase me with a whisper. You thought that because I was a sailor, I was disposable. He turned his gaze to the aristocrats on the pier, his scarred face a map of the world they had chosen to ignore. You all toasted to my memory while you allowed this man to strip my wife of her dignity. You watched as he circled her like a shark. You are all complicit in his order. But the order is changing. The captain has returned, and the debts are being called in. The Duke tried to stand, his eyes darting toward the water, perhaps considering a final, desperate plunge into the dark. But the police were already descending the stairs. Handcuffs, cold and uncompromising, snapped around his wrists, the same wrists that had once been adorned with the finest lace. "Take him," Harrington commanded, "to Newgate. He will face a jury of his peers, and God help him when the insurance adjusters are called to the stand." As the police dragged the Duke through the mud and up the stairs, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers a frantic, buzzing swarm of new gossip. They had come to see a scandal. They had witnessed a revolution. The Duke was no longer the master of the ballroom. He was a criminal in the light of day. Alexander turned to Vivienne. The silence that fell between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the 5 years apart. It was the quiet of a harbor after a storm has passed. He reached out, his calloused, salt-beaten hand catching hers. "It's over, Vivienne," he whispered. "The debts are paid. The lady's grace has finally come home." "What now, Alexander?" she asked, her eyes searching his scarred face, finding the man she had never truly lost. "The manor is empty. The money is gone. We have nothing but each other and a name the world has tried to bury." Alexander looked out at the Thames, at the first real rays of sunlight hitting the water, turning the black mud into a shimmering, silver landscape. He didn't see ruin, he saw a blank chart. "We have the sea, Vivienne, and we have the truth. Everything else can be rebuilt." They walked up the Blackwall stairs together, leaving the Duke and the mud behind them. As they reached the street, they didn't look for a carriage or a servant. They walked into the heart of London, two survivors of the Atlantic, their hands locked together as a partnership, not an ownership. The captain's return was not just a restoration of a title, it was the birth of a new era for Lady Vivienne Reed. She was no longer a widow, no longer a pawn, and no longer property. She was the woman who had found her voice in the silence of the snow, and the man who had found his sight in the darkness of war. The sea had given back what it took, and as they vanished into the morning light of a London that would never be the same, the Duke of Thornfield was nothing more than a ghost in the mud, finally buried by the tide he had tried to control. The story concludes at the very site of the Duke's greatest crime, the docks of London. As Damien Thornfield is hauled away in chains, his reputation shattered and his crimes exposed, the legal system finally acknowledges the living reality of Alexander Reed. The property whisper is replaced by the decree of the court, and the Reed family legacy is restored, though not with gold, but with the unshakable bond of two survivors who refused to be erased. This tale stands as a testament that the sea may hide the crime, but the tide always returns the witness. It highlights the victory of authentic partnership over predatory ownership. Vivienne's journey from a frozen icon of grief to a woman of action proves that while power can buy silence, it can never buy the truth. Alexander's survival is a reminder that the human spirit, when fueled by love and the thirst for justice, is more powerful than any storm. Did you cheer when the Duke hit the mud? If you enjoyed this journey from the depths of the Atlantic to the heights of justice, give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale of high-stakes vengeance and the return of the dead. Share this story with someone who needs to know that no matter how deep the betrayal, the truth will always find its way home.